Get out. This isn't a night for people like you." The words landed soft at first, almost polite, the way cruelty sounds when it's sure of itself. Delphine Rousseau stood just inside the revolving brass doors of the hotel, snow still melting on the shoulders of her old gray parka, and let the words settle over her like they belonged to someone else. Around her, the lobby glittered, champagne towers, a string quartet warming up under the new chandelier, 300 guests in tuxedos and gowns, here for the grand reopening of the finest hotel in the country, and a duty manager in a charcoal suit, not yet 30, telling her she reeked of the street. In 4 hours, she would close every hotel that carried her name, from the harbor in Halifax to the mountains above Victoria. 41 properties, going dark on a Saturday night in November, all because of what happened in the next 90 minutes at the front desk of the Laurentian. But she didn't know that yet. 90 minutes earlier, none of it had happened. Delphine had come in from the cold the way she'd come into 1,000 of her own lobbies over 40 years, quietly, through the front like anyone else. She was 52, though the tiredness in her face made her look older that night, gray hair pinned up under a knit toque she'd forgotten to take off, a parka her assistant kept threatening to throw out. Underneath it, a plain black dress that had cost $40 at a shop in Gravenhurst, because the $2,000 gown hanging in her suite upstairs had felt, when she looked at it that afternoon, like a costume for a woman she wasn't sure she still was. She'd flown in that morning from a small funeral in northern Ontario. An old friend, the man who'd loaned her and Tom their first $800 in 1979. She'd stood at his graveside in the sleet and then driven 3 hours south to be here, because the reopening had been Tom's dream before it was hers, and missing it felt like missing him twice. Nobody at the Laurentian had ever met her. That was the truth of it, and it wasn't an accident. Delphine had spent her whole life staying out of the photograph. When the company went public, the bankers wanted her on magazine covers, and she'd refused. When a documentary crew came calling, she'd sent Priya instead. She signed the checks, chose the carpets, walked the properties at odd hours in her parka and her runners, and let the general managers take the bows. The staff at the flagship knew her name was on the building. Not one of them knew her face. So when she stepped out of the cold and stood blinking under the chandelier she had personally chosen from a workshop in Murano, the young man who intercepted her saw exactly what he expected to see: a woman who didn't belong. His name was Trevor Hollis, 28, 3 months into the duty manager role, and hungry in the particular way of a man who has decided the shortest path up is to be seen keeping the wrong people out. He'd spent the whole week practicing a firm handshake in the mirror. He had opinions about elevating the guest profile. Tonight, in front of the owners he'd never met and the press he badly wanted to impress, he saw a chance to demonstrate his judgment. "Ma'am." He said it the way you'd say it to a child who'd wandered somewhere she shouldn't. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back outside. The warming shelter is 2 blocks east on Peter Street. They'll take good care of you." Delphine looked at him. There was no anger in her face, not yet. Only a kind of recognition, old and worn smooth. She'd been on the other side of that voice more times than she could count. As a 19-year-old chambermaid in a Montreal hotel, hauling linens up a service stair while guests complained, she moved too slow. As a young woman in a bank office, told to bring coffee to a loan meeting she'd actually called. As a widow at a car dealership last spring, asked 3 times if her husband would be joining her to sign. "I'm here for the reopening," she said, even, quiet. "I have a room upstairs." Trevor's mouth curved. He glanced sideways, checking whether anyone important was watching. A few were. A cluster of gowned guests near the champagne tower had turned to look, the way people turn toward a small commotion, hoping for a story. "Of course you do," Trevor said. "What's the name on the reservation?" "Rousseau." Something flickered behind his eyes, and for half a second Delphine thought he might catch it. Then he decided the coincidence was too absurd to be real, and the flicker died. Later, she would think about that half-second for a long time. The moment the truth was right there in the air between them, and he chose the story he'd already written. "Right," he said, and let a small laugh escape. "Rousseau. Like the hotel?" "Sure." He lifted 2 fingers toward the far wall, and a heavy-set man in a black security jacket peeled away from the coat check and started over. "Ma'am, I need you to understand. This is a private event. Very exclusive. I can't have you making the guests uncomfortable. I'm not making anyone uncomfortable, Delphine said. I've been standing here for 90 seconds. You're making me uncomfortable. There it was. The whole thing in 4 words. The security man arrived. His name was Garrett Doyle, 50. A former corrections officer who'd worked the flagship's night shift for 6 years and had a way of looking at people that did the math and filed them under trouble before they'd said a word. He looked at Delphine's parka. He looked at the melting snow spotting the marble. He didn't ask what was happening. He'd already decided. Let's step outside, Hon, he said. Nice and easy. I'd like to speak to whoever's in charge of the event, Delphine said. Still calm. Her hands were open at her sides, visible, the old habit rising in her without a thought. Make yourself small. Make yourself soft. Don't give them a reason. There's been a mistake, and it's an easy one to fix. If you'll just call the general manager and tell him a guest named Rousseau is at the front doors, this ends in 30 seconds. Trevor's smile hardened. He didn't like being told how to do his job by a woman he'd already filed away, and he especially didn't like it in front of a growing audience because a small crowd had gathered now, the way a crowd does, sensing blood, not knowing yet whose. The general manager, Trevor repeated, savoring it, is a very busy man tonight, hosting 300 paying guests. He does not have time to come running to the door because someone wandered in off Front Street and wants to see him. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You are not on any list. You have no invitation, and now you're refusing to leave. I'm not refusing anything. I'm asking you to make a phone call. She's not leaving, Trevor said to Garrett as though translating for him. Uncooperative. You saw it, and that word, uncooperative, went out into the room and did its quiet work, because it turned Delphine from a confused old woman into a problem, from a problem into a threat. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved from the 6 square feet of marble she'd been standing on. But now, in the story, the room was assembling in real time. She was the disturbance, and Trevor was the young manager handling it well. A woman near the Champagne Tower spoke up, loud enough to carry, the way people do when they want to be seen being on the right side. Honestly, some of us paid a fortune to be here. Can someone please just deal with this? Her name was Camille Fenwick, and she'd chaired more charity galas than she could count, and she had never once in her life been on the receiving end of a voice like Trevor's. A man beside her chuckled into his champagne. Heat moved up Delphine's neck. Not anger exactly, something older and heavier. The specific weight of being made small in front of strangers who'd looked at her for 2 seconds and decided she was the thing that needed removing. I paid for this room, Delphine said, and her voice was very quiet, and that was her mistake. There it is. Trevor turned to the crowd, performing now. The lie. Ma'am, I'm going to be generous and assume you're confused, but if you tell me one more time that you have a room in this hotel, I'm going to have to treat this as fraud. He nodded at Garrett. Can you get her details? Let's find out who she really is. Garrett stepped in close, and his hand came up toward Delphine's elbow, and something in the way he moved made her think of every man who'd ever assumed her body was theirs to steer. She stepped back on instinct, and her heel caught the edge of the marble, and she stumbled, and her hand went out to catch the coat check counter. And the small, worn envelope she'd been holding this whole time, the one she'd carried up from Muskoka in her coat pocket, slipped from her fingers and fell open on the floor. A photograph slid out. It was old, the colors gone soft and orange the way 70s photographs go. A young man and a young woman standing in front of a low cinder-block motel with a hand-painted sign that read Cedar Rest, Vacancy. The man had his arm around the woman and a paintbrush in his free hand, because they'd just finished painting the sign themselves, and they were both laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in faded blue ink, Day 1. July 1979. Us against the whole world. Delphine bent for it. She was fast, but Garrett was faster in the way that mattered. He stepped forward to keep her moving, and his boot came down on the corner of the photograph, and when she pulled it free there was a gray scuff dragged across her husband's face. For 1 second, the calm slipped. She knelt there on the marble in her $40 dress with the ruined photograph in her hand, and 300 people in gowns looked down at her, and a small child near the elevators tugged her mother's sleeve and asked, in the bright, clear voice children use for the questions adults have learned not to ask, "Mommy, why are they being mean to that lady?" No one answered her. "Up you get," Garrett said, and took Delphine's arm, And this time she didn't pull away because she had done the math too, the same math she'd done her whole life. Pull away and you're combative. Freeze and they drag you anyway. There was no version of the next 30 seconds where being reasonable saved her, so she let herself be walked, hands open, toward the cold and the door. "I'm not resisting," she said, loud enough for the phones. Because there were phones now, a dozen of them, held up over the shoulders of the beautiful people. Red lights blinking. "I want everyone to see. I'm not resisting." "Smart," Trevor said, and the word was so exactly wrong, so perfectly the thing a small man says when he mistakes cruelty for control, that a young woman standing near the banquet doors couldn't hold it anymore. Her name was Josephine Tran, Josie to the kitchen, 23, a banquet server who'd picked up the shift because her student loan payment cleared on the 1st. She'd been carrying a tray of canapés and watching the whole thing with a sickness rising in her chest, and now she set the tray down on a side table hard enough to rattle it and stepped forward. "She hasn't done anything," Josie said. Her voice shook, but it carried. "I've been standing right here. She walked in, she asked to make a phone call, and you called security. That's all that happened. That's all any of us saw." Trevor rounded on her. "This doesn't concern you. Get back to your section. I'm just saying what happened." "One more word," Trevor said, low and vicious, "and you can pick up your final check on Monday. You're a temp. You understand what that means? You're nothing here." Josie's mouth closed. She caught Delphine's eye across the marble, and in her face was something Delphine recognized and was tired of needing, an apology she had no power to make good on, and a helpless, burning shame at her own silence. But Delphine gave her the smallest nod. "Thank you," it said. "I saw you. That's more than most. And here is the thing that the phones caught, the thing that would matter later in a room with a raised seal on the wall." As Garrett walked Delphine toward the doors, the second security guard, a quiet man named Simon who'd started the job the week before, did not follow. He'd been moving to help. Then he'd watched the old woman kneel for a photograph and heard the child's question, and something in him simply refused. He stopped where he was, and he looked at Trevor, and he said, not loudly, "I'm not doing this one." And he stepped back against the wall and crossed his arms and became, for the rest of the night, a witness instead of a participant. It cost him the shift. Trevor would remember it. It didn't matter. Some men decide in one bad second who they're going to be, and Simon decided. They put Delphine outside. Not in handcuffs. This wasn't that kind of place. It prided itself on not being that kind of place. But out, through the revolving brass doors, onto the salted concrete under the porte cochere where the valets stood stamping their feet against the cold. Garrett told her the shelter was 2 blocks east and that if she came back in, he'd have the police trespass her. Then he went back inside to the warmth, and the doors turned, and Delphine Rousseau stood in the November wind in front of the finest hotel in Canada. A hotel she had built with her own 2 hands over 40 years, holding a photograph of the day it all began with a boot scuff across her dead husband's face. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that the safest thing a woman like her could be, in a moment like this, was perfectly, unbearably still. A valet, a kid of maybe 19 named Devon, watched her from beside the podium. He'd seen the whole thing through the glass and he didn't understand it, and he did the only thing he could think of. He came over and offered her his gloves. "You look froze, ma'am," he said. "Take these. I got another pair in the booth." It was such a small kindness that it nearly undid her. "Thank you," Delphine said. She didn't take the gloves. Instead, she looked at his name tag and then at his face, and she asked, "Devon, do you know who owns this hotel?" He shrugged, embarrassed. "Some company, I guess. Rousseau something. Rousseau something," she agreed softly. And then she reached into her coat, past the ruined photograph, and pulled out a phone that was 3 years old and cracked across one corner, and she pressed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice. "Rousseau Group, this is Priya. Priya." Delphine's voice was low, turned away from the doors. "It's me." There was a half-second of silence, and then the voice on the other end changed entirely. Sharpened, straightened, snapped to attention. Priya Anand had been Delphine's chief operating officer for 11 years and her friend for longer, and she could read the temperature of her boss's voice across a bad connection in a snowstorm. "Del, where are you? You were supposed to be at the reopening an hour ago. The GM's been asking." "I'm at the reopening," Delphine said. "I'm standing outside it. Your duty manager and your night security just put me on the sidewalk. They think I'm a vagrant. They stepped on Tom's photograph. Her voice caught, one syllable, and then flattened again. I need you to come down here now. And Priya, don't call ahead, don't warn them. I want to see it. I want to see the exact moment they realize. The line went quiet. Then, in a voice Delphine had heard maybe 3 times in 11 years, I'm in the car. Don't move. Don't say another word to any of them. Inside, Trevor Hollis was already telling the story to a knot of admiring guests, his hands moving, his color high. He'd handled it. Judgment, that's what the role took. Judgment and the courage to make the hard call. Camille Fenwick told him he'd done wonderfully. He was going to mention it to the GM, casually, later, how he'd kept a disruption from spoiling the night. He didn't notice the black SUV pull hard into the porte cochere 9 minutes later. He didn't notice the woman who got out of it, silver-haired, immaculate, in a coat that had cost more than his monthly salary, cross the sidewalk in 3 strides and take the old woman in the gray parka gently by the shoulders, and say something that made the old woman close her eyes. He noticed when they came through the revolving doors together. Priya walked half a step behind Delphine, the way you walk behind someone whose right-of-way is absolute, and the lobby began to feel the shift before it understood it. Heads turned. The quartet, mid-phrase, seemed to falter, because the room could see, now that the security guard by the coat check had gone rigid and gray, and that the general manager himself had appeared at the top of the lobby stairs and stopped dead with one hand on the rail. Trevor pushed forward, indignant, ready to defend his good work. Ma'am, I told you. She's the one I was. Security, can we? Priya turned on him, and her voice was not loud, but it reached every corner of that marble room the way a dropped glass reaches every corner. Do you know who this is? Trevor's certainty wobbled. She's an unticketed individual who... This is Delphine Rousseau. Priya let the name land and watched it move through the crowd like cold water. Founder, chairman, chief executive of the Rousseau Group. She built this hotel. She built the company that signs your paycheck. And mine and his. She nodded at the graying general manager on the stairs, and every person's in this building tonight. Her name is on the roof. It's carved into the cornerstone by the front doors. You stepped over it on your way to throwing her out. The silence that followed had a texture. You could feel it move through the room, phone by phone, face by face. Camille Fenwick set down her champagne with a small click and put a hand to her mouth. The man who'd chuckled found his shoes deeply interesting. The child near the elevators watched the old lady in the parka become, in the space of one sentence, the most powerful person in the building. The blood left Trevor's face in stages. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the photograph still in Delphine's hand, the one he'd let a boot come down on, and then at the cornerstone by the door he'd never once read, brass letters catching the chandelier light, Rousseau, Est, 1979, for Tom. The general manager came down the stairs too fast, apologies already spilling. Delphine held up one hand and he stopped. She didn't shout, she didn't gloat. That had never been the kind of power she carried. You wanted proof I belonged here, she said to Trevor, and her voice was steady as still water. I own the walls you were going to throw me out of, Vince. Rousseau, I had no way of knowing. You told me I reeked of the street. Her tone never rose. You told me the shelter was 2 blocks east. You said I was making you uncomfortable. It's on 20 phones. You'll be able to watch yourself. I was following procedure, elevating the guest experience. I thought I was protecting the... From what? Delphine asked. From a tired woman in an old coat? That's the whole thing, isn't it? That's the entire thing. She turned the ruined photograph over in her fingers. You didn't need more information. You had my name 3 times. You had it on my lips and on that stone and on this building. You decided a woman who looked like me couldn't be a woman who owned this. And when I told you the truth, you called it fraud, because the truth didn't match the story you'd already sold yourself. Trevor had no answer. His mouth worked, the excuses had run dry. Delphine turned to Priya, and her voice changed, still calm but with the quiet weight of a woman giving an order she means all the way down. Get me operations on the phone, she said. Every property. Tonight. Priya blinked. Del. Every Rousseau hotel closes its ballrooms and event floors at midnight local time, and stays closed to new bookings, until I know how this happened here and whether it's happening everywhere else. No galas. No conferences. Nothing on the event calendar moves until I've seen what we've become. She looked around the frozen, glittering room. Tell the 300 people in this lobby that the reopening is over. Refund every one of them. Comp every room in the house tonight. And put it in writing to all 41 properties that the woman thrown out of her own flagship was thrown out for looking poor, so that not one general manager in this country can pretend they didn't hear about it by Monday morning. That's the whole company, Priya said quietly. 41 hotels, on a Saturday night. I know exactly how many hotels I own, Delphine said. Close the floors. The order went out in under an hour. Across the country, ballroom lights came up and the music stopped and confused. Gowned guests were handed cards and apologies and the keys to comped suites. From Halifax to Victoria, the event calendar of the Rousseau Group went dark on the busiest night of the fall, and the reason traveled with it, in Priya's own blunt words, to every manager who'd ever assumed they knew a paying guest by the coat on her back. And it should have ended there. A viral clip, a fired manager, a good story about a rich woman who got her respect back. That was where most of these stories stopped, if they got told at all. But Delphine Rousseau had spent 40 years learning that one cruel man is never really the problem. So the next morning, before the clip finished its first 100,000 views, she ordered an audit. Not of Trevor, of the system that had made Trevor feel safe. She had Priya pull every guest complaint filed against the flagship in the past 6 years and flag any that mentioned being profiled, followed, questioned about belonging, or asked to prove they could pay. And when the file came back, it was thicker than either of them wanted it to be. 11 complaints, 6 years. Almost all of them from guests who in one way or another hadn't looked the part. A Cree elder in from Thunder Bay for cancer treatment, made to wait in the lobby while every white guest behind him was checked in. A young couple in wheelchairs told the accessible experience was really more suited to a different property. A black surgeon in scrubs, off a red-eye, asked 4 times whether she was sure she had a reservation. Every one of them had been marked resolved and quietly closed. Not one had reached Delphine's desk. Not one had reached Priya's. Because somewhere in the middle of the company, someone had decided it was cheaper and calmer to make the complaint disappear than to fix the thing it pointed at. Trevor hadn't invented the reflex. He'd inherited it. He'd walked into a building where a certain kind of guest got the benefit of the doubt, and a certain kind got the security guard, and he'd simply read the room and performed what he thought was wanted. That, Delphine told her board on Monday, in a voice that let nobody off the hook, is the real scandal. One man can be cruel. It takes an institution to keep him comfortable. The story stopped being about a bad night at a gala. It became about a pattern. And in Canada, patterns like that have a place to go. An investigator from the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal opened a file. The 11 guests, contacted quietly by the Rousseau Group's own counsel, because Delphine insisted the company not hide behind its lawyers but hand them the evidence, agreed to tell their stories. What had sounded, when it was one voice like a misunderstanding, sounded very different as 11 voices in a row, backed by internal records the company itself had turned over. Trevor Hollis was fired, and so, after the audit named them, were the 2 managers above him who had stamped those 11 complaints resolved and made them vanish. Garrett Doyle lost his security license when the review of the flagship's incident log turned up a years-long habit of escorting out guests who fit a certain description. None of it documented, all of it deniable until the night it wasn't. The tribunal proceeding, when it came, was not a criminal trial. No one went to prison for a night at a hotel, but the finding, when it was published, used a word the company had spent 6 years avoiding: systemic. The Rousseau Group was ordered to pay damages to all 11 guests, to overhaul its policies, and to report publicly on its progress for 3 years. At the hearing, the adjudicator asked Trevor's counsel to explain the moment on the video where his client stepped over the cornerstone, with Delphine's name on it on his way to remove her. The lawyer said his client had been under pressure, doing his best, elevating standards. The adjudicator watched the clip twice, freezing it on the frame where the boot came down on the photograph, and said only that a man's best could not be built on the assumption that a poor-looking woman was a liar, and that the company had been paying, for 6 years, for the comfort of not knowing what it already knew. Josephine Tran was called to give an account of what she'd seen. She didn't try to make herself the hero of it. She said plainly that she'd almost stayed quiet, that the words had nearly stuck in her throat, that she'd been afraid of losing a shift she couldn't afford to lose. "I said something," she told the room, "but I waited too long to say it, and I've thought about that every day since. There were 40 of us who saw. One of us spoke, and I only just barely did." Devon the valet and Simon the guard, who'd crossed his arms and refused, told their small pieces too. Delphine made sure their names were on the record beside Josie's, the three who, in a lobby full of people looking away, had each done one true thing. And Delphine herself, when the reporters found her afterward on the sidewalk outside the tribunal, kept it short. She stood in her parka. She'd stopped apologizing for the parka, and said this was never really about me. I had a phone number that ended it. I made one call, and the whole thing turned around inside of an hour. Most people standing where I stood don't have that call to make. They get the escort out, the shelter 2 blocks east, the story that they were the problem, and no one comes across the marble in a good coat to say their name. The 11 people before me didn't. That's who any of this is for." Then she added the line that ran on every channel that night: "A woman shouldn't have to own the building to be treated like she belongs in the lobby. Being a person should be enough." But Delphine Rousseau wasn't finished. A tribunal finding punished the company that had failed. She wanted to make sure the next tired woman in an old coat never needed a phone number at all. She lifted the freeze on the event calendar only when she had something real to show for it. She didn't want a press release. She wanted something a guest could point to. So now, if you walk into the lobby of any Rousseau hotel in the country, you'll find it framed by the front desk, printed plain and large enough to read from the door, a guest charter, in English and French, and, at the flagship, in Anishinaabe. You will not be questioned about your right to be here. You will not be removed without a written reason and a manager's name on it. You may ask why. You may record. You may call the number below, day or night, and reach a person whose only job is to answer. Every front desk clerk and security officer in the company went through new training. Not a video they clicked past, but real sessions on bias and de-escalation and the plain, radical idea that a woman in a cheap coat asking to make a phone call is a guest, not a threat. Complaints stopped going into the drawer that made them disappear. They go to an independent ombudsman now, someone with no reason to bury anything and no manager to protect. Josephine Tran did not go back to serving canapés. Delphine hired her onto the team that built the new training program, because the young woman who'd said she hasn't done anything when it might have cost her everything was exactly the person. Delphine wanted teaching new staff what courage looked like on a bad night. Josie tells every session the same thing: there were 40 of us in that lobby. One person spoke up, and I only just barely was that person. Don't be the 39. Be the one who speaks first. Simon got his job back, and a note in his file that he'd refused an unlawful removal on his second week, which Delphine said should follow him like a good reference for the rest of his life. Devon the valet got a scholarship to the hospitality program at George Brown because Delphine had a soft spot for kids who offered their gloves to strangers. Trevor Hollis lost his career and, for a while, didn't fight it. Months later, he wrote Delphine a long letter, not asking for anything, just owning what he'd done, and trying to understand why he'd done it so quickly, so easily, without a flicker of doubt until the flicker was too late. Delphine wrote back. She didn't forgive him exactly. That wasn't hers to give on behalf of 11 other people. But she wrote, "You can't undo a thing like that. You can only decide who you're going to be after it. The slow work of becoming better is still work worth doing." And the photograph. Tom laughing in front of the cedar rest with a paintbrush in his hand, the gray boot scuff dragged across his face that never quite cleaned off. Delphine had it framed. It hangs in her office now, next to the awards and the magazine covers she never wanted, the smallest thing on the wall, and the one she looks at most. She used the money the company set aside from the settlement for none of herself. She seeded a fund with it, legal aid and dignity training, and a traveler's fund for people turned away without cause, and named it for the date it happened. The first 11 people it helped were the 11 names from the buried file. She found every one of them herself. A few weeks after the new charter went up in the lobbies, Delphine checked into the flagship again on a quiet Tuesday, in the same gray parka, and this time a young clerk at the front desk, new, nervous, eager to do it right, greeted her the way the charter said to greet everyone, warmly, by asking her name and welcoming her home, without once looking at her coat. Behind her in line stood a man in a good suit, a family with 3 tired kids, and a woman who looked like she'd come in off the cold. No one was singled out. No one was made to prove they belonged. Delphine watched it happen from the end of the counter, and for the first time in a long time, she let her shoulders drop. Then she went up to her room, and she took the framed photograph she still travels with out of her bag, and she set it on the nightstand facing the window, so that Tom could see the city they'd built the hotel in, and she told him it was all right now. Not fixed, never fixed all the way, but better than it had been, and pointed in the right direction, which was the most either of them had ever asked of a day. The story you just heard is fiction. Delphine Rousseau isn't real, and neither is the Laurentian, and no hotel chain went dark for a night over one tired woman in an old coat. But the shelter 2 blocks east, the shove toward the door, the 4 times, "Are you sure you have a reservation?" The assumption that arrives before a single word. Those are stitched together from real days that real people live through in this country, and most of them don't end with a phone call that turns everything around. Most of them don't trend. Most of them don't get a finding with the word systemic in it. They just get lived through quietly and carried. So the question this leaves isn't whether it still happens. It does in lobbies and waiting rooms and dealerships and doorways, all over the place, all the time. The real question is what the rest of us do when we're standing there in a good coat, watching it happen to somebody who doesn't have a number to call, because in that lobby, 300 people had phones, and only 1 banquet server, 1 valet, and 1 brand new guard found their voice. And the whole difference between a humiliation and a turning point came down to whether somebody nearby decided not to look away. So here's the honest question, and drop your answer in the comments. No wrong ones. If you'd been standing by that champagne tower, watching them walk her toward the doors, would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have been the one to step forward and say she hasn't done anything? Tell the truth. Then ask yourself what you'll do the next time it isn't a story on a screen. If this one moved you, share it with someone who needs to see it. Hit that like button so it reaches one more person. And subscribe, because the next person they turn away at the door might not own the building, but they'll still deserve every ounce of the respect that Delphine had to fight for.